Hi, I'm Jeff Cook, and this is Backyard Basics, filmed for one more month by Jacob Peed, valedictorian at Taylor County High School, which makes this the single smartest television show in Middle Georgia. And for the last few months, we've kind of been doing some potpourri, some, shows talking about a lot of different things going on in Middle Georgia, in Taylor County and Peach County. So I decided to kind of continue that trend this month. With it being the middle of summer, we're in June now. The ball's really rolling. We got plenty of good rain, for the last 3 weeks. Things are growing, things are progressing. So I thought maybe I'd just talk about what's going on around us, maybe some things you're seeing as you're driving around, the things that I'm seeing, and the things that I'm getting phone calls about. Start off here, I know we talked last month. This is our UGA on-farm cotton variety trial we've got on a farm that's farmed by Todd Bone. We've got 14 different varieties, looking at them across this field. And the reason that we do that with UGA, do it across the south part of the state, that is to look at some of the top cotton varieties that our producers have access to and see how they respond in as many different situations as possible. This is a dry land situation here, of course, no pivot, but we've got these in pivot irrigated fields. We've got them all across the state, so we can see how it performs with different management practices and in different environments. So we're going to probably come back and visit this at least once a month until the end of the season, and hopefully be able to come back out here when we get to picking and see how these varieties do. We're going to move on. We got a bunch of stops to make. I got to do it real quick, so I got to give a talk in a little bit. So we're going to move on and see what's going on in the landscape. All right, so we moved over to some muscadine vines that I happen to see over here, and I wanted to point something out. Muscadines flower and produce fruit on new growth. That's why we always go in there, and in previous shows I've talked about how to prune muscadines, how you take them back to the main vine. You leave a little spur, and from that little spur where you're going to get growth and you're going to get flowers and you're going to get fruit, muscadines. This is a good example of what happens if you don't. This muscadine vine probably wasn't really pruned that much, but it doesn't have a lot of excessive growth on it. So you can see, if you look at this, you can see a lot of fruit. You can see these will be muscadines here. These flowers still forming or falling off. Little muscadines forming. You see the muscadines all over this vine. If you pan over to the one next to it that's really, really, really overgrown, you don't see that fruit anywhere. You see a little bit out here on the ends, on the tips, but you just don't see anything down in the rest of the vine. And that's just because there's not a lot of new growth. Another thing that I was going to point out too, because I've seen a lot of this around, is if you can even see these. I don't know, Jacob, can you see them? Can you see the bottom of this leaf?
I don't know, I'm zooming.
Anytime on fruit trees or vines or regular old ornamental trees, if you're seeing a lot of ants crawling up and down the vine or climbing up and down the tree, it's usually because you have something up there that they're usually not eating the insects, they're usually eating the honeydew they produce. There's ants on this leaf right now that are eating the honeydew that are being produced by the aphids that are on the backside of this leaf. So if you start seeing some misshapen leaves, some crinkled up new growth, a lot of times that is from aphids that'll be feeding on that new growth, and as they feed on it, they cause the cells to be malformed, and then the whole leaf will be misshapen. But there's plenty of insecticides that you can spray for that. But a lot of times, if you're like looking at the trunk, or if you're looking at limbs or a vine, and you see ants crawling up and down it, and you don't have ripe fruit, it's usually because aphids, scale, some insect like that that's sucking on the underside of the leaf and producing honeydew. We're gonna move on. Like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about everything. Standing here in this lawn made me think about fertilizing grasses. Most of our grasses that we have, or most of the ones we deal with, really most of what we deal with is a mixture of a bunch of different types of grasses, but a lot of yards are centipede. So I'm just going to kind of give you a basic recommendation on centipede. Centipede, they call it it's popular, or we promote it because it's easy to take care of. You don't have to do a lot to it. Keep it watered if it gets real dry, and a little bit of fertilizer will go a long way. The yards that I see that are a problem, centipede is where centipede has problems is where it's over fertilized, over watered, over managed. So right now, May and June is probably the first time of the year that you should fertilize centipede, or really any lawn, and it doesn't take a lot. If you just say, to make math easy, if you're fertilizing an acre of centipede grass, 100 pounds of 15-0-15 would be adequate for that acre of grass. That would give you 15 pounds of nitrogen on the whole acre, and you could do that 2 to 3 times a year and you would not be overdoing it. When you start getting to 34-0-0, you would cut that rate back tremendously. You know, you're looking at probably putting out 25 to 35 pounds each time you do it. You don't want to overdo it with nitrogen because you'll get excessive growth, you get excessive thatch, and then the thatch leads to drought stress in the summertime, and it can lead to winter kill if we get cold weather in the winter. So don't overdo it on centipede. The same recommendation will hold true for Bermuda grass and other grasses, but you would just bump that up by about 50%. Same kind of fertilization. If you want to try and keep your yard green for longer, put little shots out, monthly, and don't put it all out at one time. You can put out a little shot of fertilizer each month during the summertime, and probably stop about August, as we start getting into the end of summer, start of fall. Since I was talking about fertilization, I get a lot of questions about it. Big pecan trees in the yard, how can I better take care of them? How can I manage them? If you wanted to fertilize, you're not too late to fertilize pecan trees. Our general recommendation is like a February, March that fertilization, and then a late August fertilization. If I had yard trees, I probably would just put a fertilizer application out there on them in the middle of summer, towards the end of summer, and be done with it. But a tree this size probably would require at least about 25 pounds of a complete fertilizer, like a 5, 10, 15. And if you can find one that's a pecan special, it should have some zinc in it. The zinc will help out with fruit wood production. It helps. Pecan trees just require a lot of zinc, so if you can find a zinc in the fertilizer, that'd be good. If you can't, then 3 to 5 pounds of zinc sulfate would help. Just spread around these trees in the drip zone, because most people aren't going to have these irrigated. So just in the drip zone, something like this, and if you can water it, it'd be great. The reason I don't normally recommend too much fertilization on a pecan tree or too much management on a yard tree is because of this right here. Not because the leaf's all chewed up by something, I don't know what did that. But these little spots here, little black spots on this leaf, spots on those leaves, that is the beginning. Well, that's pecan scab. It's a disease that will move from the leaves, and then you start getting nut scab. And if you start getting scab on the nuts, then they'll never size, a lot of them will fall off, and you won't ever produce any. So that's why I don't recommend people putting too much money or effort into a yard tree, keeping it, trying to make it really productive. Just try and keep it healthy with the minimal fertilization, a little bit of water as you can, because a spring like we've had this spring, wet, plenty of rainfall during bloom and stuff, you may not see a lot of yard pecans out there. So just something to think about when you're thinking about fertilizing trees. We're gonna move on. All right, so we moved over to the apple orchard here at Taylor Orchards, and I know that a lot of you don't have apples. A lot of y'all have pears, so I'm gonna talk real quick about apples and pears and kind of how you can make them produce a little better, how you can make them produce where you can reach them, and then show you something I think is pretty cool that you might think is interesting. I think it's really cool. Anyway, apples, and pears in your home landscape always growing straight up, very vigorous upright growth, and you probably noticed that all your flowers are on the tips. There's no flowers. When you have a really vigorous shoot, this was pointed upright, a couple weeks ago. When you have a really vigorous shoot growing upward, you're gonna have a bunch of little dormant latent buds, no flower buds, okay? Not until you bend this limb over do you start getting some new growth that'll have extra flowers on it here. This will probably have a flower next year too. So with your pears and your apples, that's why we always try and get you to spread your limbs out to 45 degrees, thin them out some and spread them out, because then you'll get more production of fruit along that stem. With this production system, we got these apples on a trellis. And one thing you might be able to see, you might be able to tell from here, you really want to be able to use this trellis. You got a bottom wire, a middle wire, and a top wire. So you want to have a few limbs on each wire. Well, I came in here a couple weeks ago and realized there weren't many limbs on this middle wire. So I did this technique, and I don't remember what the technique's called. But you might remember from biology, you might not, but just really basically, this shoot as it's growing it has apical dominance. The tip dominates all that's below it, and until it gets high enough, all these buds down here you can see along this stem will be dormant. They'll just be sitting here. They won't break. But what you can do, since we needed some growth here, what you can do is you can come in here, and since the chemicals are coming down the stem, you can come in here with a knife, or they use, you know, a hacksaw, something like that, and just nick the cambium, the outer layer of the bark, nick it, cause an injury. That way the chemicals can't go down to that bud and can't suppress that bud. And what will happen is in a couple days, this bud will break. And what you'll get, which is really cool, a couple weeks ago I came in here, I did that same technique right here on these two buds. You got new growth here, new growth here. So what I'm hoping is that these will continue to grow this year, and I can move these out here, and these are going to cover this part of my trellis. Because you want to have them right here as good as you can. The main reason we put them on the trellis is for support. You know, get them as flat as you can to get extra production, but then the trellis is there to support them once they do get loaded down with apples. Because, you know, a limb like this, if it wasn't supported by the trellis, would be touching the ground once they got loaded down with the number of apples that it has on it. That technique can be used for a lot of different trees, but especially on your pears and your apples and things. If you've got them in your yard and you need to reshape them, that's a good technique. Easy way to do it. Just cut right above the bud. That bud will break. You'll have a new limb. All right, so after a wardrobe change and a haircut, we're back out in the field looking at a few things going on in Middle Georgia agriculture and gardening and farming. Just kind of give you some pointers of what's going on. First off, real quick, a lot of people have corn that's tasseling and starting to silk. And right now, even though you don't see that ear very prevalently, is a very important time to look for stink bugs. I actually caught one out here. I don't know if you can see it, but I've got a brown stink bug here in my hand. These stink bugs will actually feed on that corn through the shuck right now this time of year, so controlling stink bugs is pretty important. If you don't control them now, what'll happen is when you pick your corn, you'll have, you know, if it's not eaten up by corn earworms, there'll be, you know, individual kernels will be brown, rotten, maybe even whole rows of them. And if they get bad enough, it'll actually the ear will be misshapen. It'll be curved. One whole side of that ear will not form right. This is my partner over here, Ryan. He came with me to do a little 4-H fishing afterwards, but he's also checking out the corn. Another thing you might see, there goes our stink bug. Another thing you might see sometimes is
the other thing you might see is me doing the floss.
Okay, now go. Go. What you also might see is if you apply fertilizer when these leaves are wet, you can get injury from fertilizer burn. Fertilizers are salts. If you get fertilizer put over the top of corn and don't get it watered in, then you can have some injury. Nothing that bad here, it just weakens that leaf. You know, anytime you take away green leaf tissue, you know, you can have issues with, you know, filling kernels, you know, the plant, the regular physiological processes that plant has to go through as the season goes on. Finally, with 18, 19 days of rain in May, you know, still continuing with heavy rains in June, you know, you might be seeing some yellow corn in your garden or around. You know, if there's not another underlying factor other than nutrients, which we could have lost a lot of nutrients with the rains, you know, you still have time on this corn crop to add a little nitrogen to green that plant up and still produce a decent ear of corn. When I say other underlying issues, it could be that this corn is not planted deep enough and didn't get good root formation. It could be nematodes. It could be some other issue other than fertility. But most of the time, you know, sandy soils, a lot of rain, it's going to be fertilizer running out. So, you know, you can add a little bit extra nitrogen with some like 3400 and kind of correct this. You know, you're not going to yield the same in this corn as you will in the other corn behind me, but you still have a chance to make some corn and, you know, salvage that crop. All right, so we moved down here to some fruit trees, and I'm actually standing in front of a nectarine tree, which you don't see a lot of in Middle Georgia. We have plenty of peaches, not many nectarines, and I'm gonna kind of explain why. But I came over here because I wanted to show you this. This is brown rot. Everybody's seen brown rot on peaches. This is brown rot on a nectarine. It gets on all stone fruit. But I always get questions about how to control brown rot. You know, people see this now and they want to spray now. The problem with doing that is that you're really not doing much. You know, we need to do some cover sprays during the summer to help keep it to a minimum, but the really important time to spray for brown rot is during the bloom. So 1 to 2 sprays during bloom will help prevent a lot of this brown rot. Spraying now is not doing a lot for controlling of this disease. The same thing with scab, which is when you'll see a lot of the speckled little black spots on top of your peaches, peach scab. The real infection occurs during bloom, and it doesn't really show up until sugars start to increase in the fruit. Same thing with brown rot. As sugars increase, then you start seeing more issues with disease there. my son knocked my nectarine out of my hand. I was going to show you something else. Don't see this a lot on peaches. It's not as prevalent, or you can't see it as well because they got fuzz on the skin. You know, the fruit's fuzzy. Since this nectarine's not fuzzy, you can kind of see this round ring right here. You're probably seeing a lot of this on, if you got pears or if you got apples, something like that, you're probably seeing a lot of this. It's just called a frost ring. That's where this, you know, when in March when this thing was blooming, it got cold enough on the flower, where the flower was around the shuck or around the fruit, to injure that, damage that tissue, and it's still showing up right now. And finally, you don't see this on peaches as much, but on nectarines, the main reason we don't have much commercial nectarine production is because when they start to get ready, we get a lot of cracking. This is not as bad as normal, but you get a lot of cracking all over the fruit. And you know, this is not marketable if you're trying to sell it to a store. So that's the number one main reason we don't grow a lot of nectarines around here. But the same things you're going to see on nectarines, you're going to see on peaches, other than this splitting. And then one other thing, I didn't see anything in this tree, but you know, with the cold injury we had early in the spring, we have a lot of weird looking fruit. We have a lot of fruit that has a malformed pit or a dead pit, and some of this fruit is kind of deteriorating from the inside out. It's actually rotting from the inside out. So we're seeing some weird stuff if it's not your normal, you know, cold injury, or you know, your normal, you know, insect problem like pumpkin curlew out down in there boring around the pit. But we're going to run over and look at some tomatoes that, you know, with an issue that happens to some people here and there that we're going to talk about. All right, so we moved down here to the tomato patch, and just to show you something that I see a good bit of because I make mistakes in my own garden, but I get questions about it, and also I'll often warn people about using, you know, certain things in their garden. I get questions all the time about using straw or hay to mulch tomatoes or other vegetables. And while it's a good idea because it holds moisture, it keeps the soil cool, it keeps weeds down, it can be bad. In this situation, this is not bad hay. But these tomato plants were actually started off in some hay that had come from a pasture or hay field that was treated with a certain herbicide. Some of these herbicides last a pretty good time on the actual grass. When it's rolled up into hay, it can actually move from the field to wherever you take the hay, and it can actually pass through the animals' bodies and then be deposited. So manures or hay from pastures treated with certain herbicides need to be basically avoided, because what will happen, these were started off with the hay that was in question that had some herbicides on it, and you can see some, I just had it right here looking at it, you can see some twisting, some cupping of these leaves, how these leaves look really odd, and even this curled up's probably more of a heat thing, but this twisting and cupping is very characteristic of a phenoxy or an auxin type herbicide. This is the same thing you would see as if you were to spray 2,4-D or something like this near your garden. You would probably get a little bit of movement, and you probably see a little bit on some tomato plants. But this is actually from the 2,4-D or the products that were in not the 2,4-D, but the products that were in the actual hay, and this plant still has a little bit of it in it. It's still taking some up. It still might even be some from the soil. Same thing can be from manure. If you got manure from cattle that were fed the hay that had the herbicides in it, you can still have the same kind of issue. So you always want to be careful when using manures or hay or straw. Know the source, know where it came from, know how it was treated, and know if these herbicides were on it. They last a long time in the manure, they last a long time in the hay. So, not just because it's been sitting out for a year doesn't mean that it's going to be gone, doesn't mean that it's safe. So just asking the farmer, the grower, what they treat their hay fields with will help you know if, it's something you should or should not use when you're talking about vegetables. All right, we moved over to squash patch because there's something I wanted to show everybody, and I can't remember if I've done it on a TV show or not. I've talked to so many people about it the last few weeks. We've been talking about problems with pollination. People always, with the rainy weather, with the lack of sun, you're gonna have some pollination issues because pollen movement is tough. You don't normally have pollination problems on squash because the flowers are so big, so showy, and they're so attractive to bees, bumblebees, and different things that they're usually going to be moving out here even in bad weather conditions, and they're going to move that around. In tomatoes, you might see it because the flowers are smaller, they're not as attractive to bees and things. High humidity, a lot of rain, low sunlight. you can have issues with, you know, the pollen movement from the bees, from the wind, from whatever. But one thing I always get questions about is early on in squash is people are like, I've got a lot of blooms, but they all keep falling off. So I was going to show you, kind of why that is. There are actually male and female flowers on a squash plant. You can see this flower is just a stem and a flower. This flower opened up, and this flower is not opened up yet, but what do you see at the base of it? This is the actual, what will become, you know, the squash. Once this is pollinated by this male flower. So a lot of times early on you get these male flowers that just open up, they're really showy, they fall off, you have no fruit. Not until you start seeing flowers that have the actual fruit of the base, you know, the ovary at the base, will you actually start getting getting squash. Same thing with all cucurbits. You can find it in all of them. It's pretty obvious which one's the male and which one's the female. But that's just something I wanted to show you because we always have problems like that. And then we always get some issues with some blossom end rot in squash, in tomatoes, and normally it's always associated with calcium deficiency. Normally we associate it with either fluctuating up and down, you know, water patterns, but a lot of times it's also just because we let tomatoes or squash or other things get too dry. Same thing on peppers. This year, the calcium movement, the calcium deficiency has actually probably been caused by too much water. Calcium only moves into the roots with water movement. So if there's no water moving into that root system, no water moving in the plant because it's cloudy, it's rainy, the soils are waterlogged, calcium's not getting up in that plant. So the same thing, same calcium deficiency can happen. And now with these things starting to produce, putting on a lot of squash, cucurbits, things like that, you know, as these plants are getting bigger, they're getting a little stressed, a little run down from producing vegetables, producing their fruit. It's always important to try and keep a fungicide on them. So, you know, protective fungicides will help keep powdery mildew, things like that, downy mildew at bay, because that's when they start becoming more prevalent. Excessive rain, you know, stress from heavy fruit load, and just bigger plants that don't allow as much airflow through the canopy. All those factors can go together to cause more disease problems. So staying on top of a fungicide program is really important. And I have not seen much this year so far. I mean, we had a stink bug up in the corn. I've not seen much in the way of insects. I mean, I always tell people I live in the stink bug capital of the world, I believe, or the true bug capital of the world. And squash bugs usually, you know, they usually carry me away. I've not seen any squash bugs in my squash patch at the house. So, you know, maybe with a colder than normal or colder than the last 3-year winter, maybe this rainfall is also helping. But the insect pressure, knock on wood somewhere, has been fairly low. So I have not seen as many insects out in the fields other than the gnats, which my daughter says serve no really good purpose in the world. So, but other than that, you know, the insect problems have not really been that big of a deal. All right, well, hopefully the things that I've shown you in the last few minutes, you know, are things that you're seeing in the landscape, things you're seeing in your garden, and hopefully it's kind of, you know, showed you or helped you understand what's going on, better understand what's going on, and maybe just taught you a little bit about some of the things that I see out in the landscape or what's going on in other people's properties, other people's gardens. As always, if you got questions or comments, you know, give me a call or shoot me an email. I'll be happy to a lot of times come out and see what's going on, and if I can't tell you what it is over the phone, you know, make a diagnosis and maybe help you improve your situation for the next time. As always, I'm Jeff Cook. This is Backyard Basics, where we're filmed in your backyard. Now let's go fishing.